Welcome to AnthroDish, the show about food, culture, and identity. I'm your host, Sarah Dugnan. We started out our season last week with an expansive interview with writer and journalist Alice Driver, but I wanted to shift gears and do a solo episode to touch in on some of the updates for the show, life, the universe, and everything. So grab your towels. If you're watching this instead of listening, that is the biggest change. Despite being very averse to the idea of adding video recording to AnthroDish for many years, I finally come on board. I spoke with a former guest about using a program called Riverside after we had some really embarrassing technical glitches towards the end of last season. The guest is generally just a very lovely human being, but I really appreciated them putting forward their preferred podcast recording space and spent some time over the off season learning about it and all that it had to offer. And it was pretty cool. So, old dog, new tricks. I think one of the biggest reasons for the shift on my part is that I was really challenged last year by just how unstable social media platforms can be. I've been fortunate enough to build a really great sense of community on particularly Instagram and find a lot of really wonderful food and politically minded people through social media, Substack as well. But I've also seen how swiftly platforms can change in terms of what they value. So reels, no reels, photo dumps, no photo dumps, collaborations, no collaborations. It just changes on a dime. And as a podcaster, I want to make sure that my body of work remains accessible to as many people as it can for as long as it can, if not forever, on as many stable platforms as it can. So I use Libsyn, which I lovingly refer to as the dinosaur of RSS feeds, to host my show, and I'm not worried about that one ever going belly up. It's been one of the longest lasting and hardiest platforms, but I'm shifting to include video so that it can be a podcast on YouTube as well. After talking to a lot of people who know heaps more about it than I do, like Maggie of Karis Maggie from last season or Katie Quinn of Q Katie from season 1 or 2, I feel pretty confident in expanding onto YouTube, but in a very low pressure kind of way, just to see how it goes. And as a way to have a landing pad, just in case connecting through social media changes in a way that is unpredictable and volatile. Aside from technological updates, I also have very big life updates. I'm not sure if I referenced it much in the 8th season, but I spent the entire season pregnant while recording. So this season, I have a new little baby with me, and his name's Kylian, like Mbappe, which no one gets, but now I've said it. I've scheduled most of my interviews for his nap periods, but I'm returning to the chaos of earlier seasons. If you've been here since the beginning, I'm sure you remember moments where Ray came charging into interviews, and we just had to roll with it. The possibilities of disruption is just what life looks like for me. So there may be the occasional video drop-in of Kylian, there may be the occasional squawk on his part, but otherwise it's business as usual here. This season already feels like a big energetic shift for me. Last year, I had spent a lot of my time after burnout balancing teaching and a 9-to-5, and it felt like I was starting from scratch. I was also really unsure of just general directions in life after my brother passed away, and it took a lot to pull out potential guests for that season. I am really grateful we got through it, and I'm endlessly appreciated for the friends that showed up to come back on this show and believed in me when I wasn't really sure what was going on in my life. I was worried a lot about who was listening, what it was for, the typical existential questions that you have when you're creating something. Also, the world just feels so different than it did when I first started out podcasting. Here in Canada, we can't even access news across social media platforms, and Google has also added some restrictions to what news we're able to search through their platform as well. And this is because of a new bill that was meant to make big tech pay to have their platforms feature the work of Canadian journalists, but ultimately it is a very complicated dynamic in terms of access as well. Food is also changing, at least to me. I've been writing more regularly on my newsletter, which is at sarahDugnan.substack.com. And I've been thinking very deeply about the fractures that we saw early on in the pandemic around the food system and reliability, and how it's really become full fissures at this point. There's so much difficulty in affording food, even if you have a stable job. And grocery stores in Canada have been caught in these historically large price fixing schemes. And instead of changing course, they're just giving out Marvel comic cards for your purchases. I don't know. I don't see the foodie culture that existed when I started out in 2018. And I'm not sure if it's not proliferating because a lot of millennial foodies are shifting gears in their 30s and 40s. Maybe because it's a luxury to get charcoal ice cream and people just want their broccoli to not be rotting. I'm not really sure, but I'm seeing that as a pretty big shift as well. But what I do know for sure is that we're going into this new era with a clear eye for discussion and analysis around food. The guests that I have this season so far are from many different dynamic realms and perspectives. There's the hard investigations into Tyson meat packers and their treatment of migrant laborers. There's questions around ideas of balancing pleasure and subsistence in North American eating, how climatic change and drought stress have changed olive oil production in Texas, talking back to diet culture as it rapidly changes in the era of Ozempic, finding ways to connect to the idea of nourishment without feeling like you're losing yourself in all the joy and flavors. And there's some more lighthearted explorations too. Why it's important to use food in fiction and how annoying it can be when you're reading a book and there's zero food, or you're watching Gossip Girl and they're walking past a big platform of food and not touching it. I'm trying my best to balance the heavy and the playful, to show up with both. It's important for me to do that because rest and joy are very necessary components to maintaining your health and sanity when you're tackling big and violent and oppressive issues of our times. So now that I'm entering season 9, this is where you're finding me right now. Almost 33, mom of 2, coffee slugging, and ready for some very powerful conversations with some really cool people in food. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for taking the time over the years to always show up. It really does mean the world to me that I get to do this and connect with people. It's truly such a joy, and I hope that you get as much out of it as I do. In addition to my newsletter, which comes out bi-weekly on Sundays, the podcast episodes will come out as usual on Tuesdays. You can find promotions and sneak peeks across TikTok at AnthroDish and on Instagram at AnthroDish Podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in, and be sure to tune in next Tuesday for a conversation with journalist and food writer Andrea Bennett on their new book, Hearty. Sound editing and production was done by Lucas Wojcicki at lucassound.com. Check out his website if you're in need of audio production or music composition for your podcasts. AnthroDish is produced in partnership with the American Anthropological Association. Thank you so much, and we'll catch you next week.